Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Tabletops and Taverns. This episode, like so many others, I'm going to discuss a little bit about a common element in RPGs of all sorts. Traps. And hazards as well, because they are related. Now, don't worry. I'm not going to sit here with the intention of convincing you whether you should use them or not. Traps and hazards are such an intrinsic part of presenting a dangerous environment, regardless of genre, that they're almost on par with the inclusion of enemies and treasure itself in basic adventure design. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about what traps in general do, broad categories of traps and hazards, and how to combine them with other encounters, whether to hinder or help the player characters. And yes, there are certain instances where traps can be used to help the player characters. So before we start, just what are traps and hazards? It seems obvious, but there's actually a few things that don't quite count, and a few things that could, depending on the circumstances. In their most basic form, traps and hazards are objects or environmental effects that are designed to either inhibit movement, hinder, or harm beings that are in the area that they target. The main difference between them is that traps tend to be constructed and active, whereas most hazards are passive, usually not the act of a direct preparation. This isn't always the case, as certain traps can be created accidentally, such as debris washing up against the far side of a door, ready to tumble on whomever opens said door. Certain hazards can be created, such as a spell that enchants an area with slick ice, or lighting a fire spreading slowly over the area that you're in. However, these are usually exceptions to general design placements. A special note is that puzzles or puzzle rooms don't necessarily count as traps, although some people might count them as such. A lot of people lump them in with traps because they're similar, mind you, but they just aren't categorically the same. Puzzle-locked and secret doors might very well deny a group from progressing further, but don't generally actively harm them or cause immediate concern with movement besides just being unable to pass. Now, if you add some sort of threat, such as a puzzle room that begins to fill with water and seals the characters in, or something similar, then it becomes a trap. This is mostly an important distinction if your traps grant experience, which a lot of systems actually have. In fact, you can use traps, and to a lesser extent hazards, as encounters all in their own. 3rd edition and other modern games recognize this, and often grant experience for bypassing or overcoming a trap just as if they were a monster. Even some old-school adventures would have experience awards for surviving or bypassing certain particularly challenging traps. Entire classic dungeons were designed around the idea that traps could provide as much of a challenge, if not more, than simple combat encounters. You can take this a step further and include traps in addition to monsters in an encounter, although that will require certain considerations of design, which we'll talk about later on. Let's put aside hazards for a moment and focus on traps. There's a couple categories of traps that I'm going to address, and I don't mean like mechanical or magical, although these are perfectly good organizations to divide them into. For purposes of this discussion, it's more useful for us to divide them by complexity, because that can cover traps found both in sci-fi, fantasy, or hell, even other genres entirely. I'm going to borrow a page from 5th edition and cover standard traps, complex traps, and one I'm going to add, simple or improvised traps. Although I'm going to use slightly different definitions for them, since I usually try to avoid exact game mechanics in these Tabletops and Taverns videos. Each of these traps requires a different degree of preparation, and simple improvised traps are likely to be set up on the fly by creative players at some point. Now let's take a look at what traps have in common, so you can keep them in mind when you place them in your own adventures. All traps generally have a triggering condition, and then an effect. Most well-designed ones also have some method of bypassing them, especially when set to guard an entrance or a container that is in common use. If a shopkeeper traps the coffer of their shop, for instance, it's going to have some method that keeps the shopkeeper from getting owned by their own trap. If monsters are guarding a lair, they're going to have some way to get past the trap to get into their own lair, whether it be a safe route around it, a lever that can temporarily disable it, or something similar. Of course, some traps are more for hunting or protecting places where no one is supposed to go at all. It's alright to create these sorts of traps without any sort of bypass mechanism if you want. Triggers can be any number of things. Standard and simple improvised traps have some sort of trigger condition that's immediately noticeable, while complex traps may just delay their actions or merely set something into motion by a trigger, only to act later, and possibly repeatedly. Attempting to open a chest or a door without the proper key, triggering a tripwire, or stepping directly onto a false cover of a pit trap all count as triggers. In a more modern setting, entering the wrong code in a keypad or attempting unauthorized access of a computer might also trigger a trap. Triggers can be pretty much anything, from physical pressure plates to performing certain actions near magical sensors, but generally require action on the part of the player character to set things in motion. The effect of the trap can be some sort of attack or damaging effect, something that hinders the character's movement or imposes other status effects on them, or even things that change an entire room around or release ongoing effects. This is where we see the major split between standard, complex, and simple improvised traps. Standard traps are generally single-use traps with a direct cause-effect method of operation. They generally fire off once triggered, and then they're done. Some magical versions of these traps may be able to reset themselves, and even mechanical versions might have multiple shots stored in them, but generally, these things require the characters to trigger them again if they want to have their effect yet again. If a character steps onto a pressure plate and triggers a swinging scythe blade, or fails to open a locked property and gets sprayed in the face with acid or something, that's a standard trap. The trigger is performed, the effect happens, and then that's it. It's usually resolved with a single roll or just a couple rolls. Although admittedly, it might actually take a character a few actions to escape the situation the trap leaves them in. For instance, falling down a pit may be pretty instant and only take one roll to avoid or fall. But said pit doesn't go away once the trap is done, the character's still at the bottom of a pit and has to get out. From a design perspective, standard traps are manufactured, meant to be a permanent part of a container or area, and tend to be more compact than complex traps, although this isn't always necessarily true. Standard traps are generally placed as elements of an adventure, but usually they're simple enough to be created on the fly as well. So if you're using a random encounter or have to come up with an adventure on the fly, you can certainly feel free to include standard traps relatively easily. In fact, many games that have trap rules also have lists of standard traps to include, similar to how they may list monsters or enemies. Complex traps are a different order entirely. A complex trap may result in a multi-step effect from a single trigger, or ongoing effects that take place over several rounds. Many of the most memorable traps in fiction are considered complex traps, and they generally require a larger amount of room than a simple trap. Complex traps can be seen as relatively simple in their overall structure, but because of the ongoing nature of their threat, they become more challenging. The classic room with crushing moving walls, or a rolling boulder that careens down a narrow corridor after the player characters, both count as complex traps. Complex traps may include rooms with multiple whirling blades, or ones that slowly fill in with some sort of liquid or toxic gas, and so on and so forth. The defining factor is that a complex trap may either activate over and over again, or produce an effect that is active over several rounds, or drastically affect the terrain entirely. Complex traps are also manufactured, and are meant to be a permanent fixture, although usually more of a place than an individual container. Many complex traps are what might be considered death traps, meant to completely destroy those caught within them, and may be designed to cause serious damage or otherwise render the entire area they're in difficult to traverse, so that even if the intruders survive, they'll still have to navigate the aftermath of the trap. Where standard traps are things that can be thrown in on the fly, complex traps generally require a lot more planning. However, Complex traps can stand on their own as a full encounter, with or without monster accompaniment, and as such they can make for some more of the memorable encounters for a group. One only need ask any group who's survived the Tomb of Horrors to see that. The final major category I'm covering are simple improvised traps, and while many of these have a lot in common with standard traps, they tend to be things that can be crafted or thrown together out of found materials. Some of them can be rigged in quite a short period of time, so they aren't so much permanent fixtures. Hunter snares, log falls, weighted nets, and even bear traps can all fit into this category. Unlike standard traps, they tend not to be permanent fixtures of the area, as I mentioned. Sometimes a particularly ambitious group of players may want to set a trap, and this is the sort of trap that usually comes to mind, especially if you have an outdoorsman like a ranger or a scout in their midst. If the players want to do this sort of thing, I usually have no problem with it in my games, as I encourage creative solutions to all sorts of encounters. But remember this, if the party can do it, so can creative NPCs, especially if they know that the player characters are in the area. These sort of traps are rarely deadly, but they may often entangle, maim, or otherwise hinder a character's movement. So what roles might we find for traps in an adventure? The most obvious is simply as a speed bump, encouraging an adventuring party to stop and check things before simply barging forward. You don't have to go full old school and force the party to crawl inch by inch searching every corridor, but a few very well placed traps, with their logical placement, can give them pause, resulting in the group taking much more care, and thus more time. Another use is as a skill gate, although this is really something I try to avoid. Basically, if at least one character in the party in a system that uses skills hasn't devoted that many skills to be able to identify and remove the traps, they're going to trigger it. It's not an approach I really like to use, but it may work for some. Especially if your group is metagame oriented. Traps can serve as resource sinks, just like any other encounter, costing time to avoid or healing in spells that, these players would rather use on something else. Finally, and most importantly, traps can be an encounter component. Even if they're not the entire encounter itself, a trap can fill the role of any monster in an encounter design. For example, a trap that limits the party's movement, such as a pit trap or a collapsing bridge, can be used in conjunction with enemies with ranged attacks, just like a tank-type mob could. A room riddled with spike traps or flame jet traps could easily be navigated once they're all found, but if a combat breaks out, canny opponents can attempt to force player characters into the danger areas even if they already know them, and vice versa. It's worth considering traps in nearby rooms when designing encounters as well, because intelligent players may figure out ways to lure or force powerful opponents into those traps. Now, before we take a look at some of the more practical considerations of traps, I haven't talked about hazards a whole lot, so let's take a quick look at those. Hazards are things like fire, areas of deadly cold, rivers, slime pits, etc. Passive terrain that may hinder or harm a character. A pool of acid just sitting there is a hazard, as is a flow of lava. Like traps, they're not creatures, and they might be avoided with skill checks and the like, but unlike traps, they generally aren't triggered, although a few might be. Landslides, for instance, or collapsing tunnels count as hazards rather than traps, although they share more in common with traps. Hazards can serve a role in a similar manner to traps, mostly as a barrier to character progress, or as a section of terrain that the characters may take damage crossing. If used as an encounter in and of themselves, the interaction is generally limited to figuring out how to bypass the hazard, but if you use it in conjunction with another encounter, hazards can modify that encounter. For instance, a room with an icy floor might hamper land-bound characters' movements, while allowing free movement for flying creatures attacking them, thus tilting the balance of the encounter that might otherwise be even or even tilted towards the players. A lot of time, hazards are included with traps because they function similarly in a lot of rule sets, but hazards generally present a much more passive threat. Now let's take a look at some of the practical considerations when including traps and hazards in an adventure. A lot of these are really only going to apply to traps, but where applicable, you'll probably need to think about them for hazards as well. First is triggers. Almost all traps have trigger events, in fact, all of them should have trigger events, and some hazards may as well. These triggers may not necessarily be immediately adjacent to the trap's effect area, and can thus be used to split a party up, especially in preparation for monsters joining the fray. A pressure plate could drop a portcullis some distance back down a corridor, for instance, either sealing the characters into an area or splitting a group by descending in the middle of them. Further, when a character is searching for traps, the trigger may be the most important thing for them to find. Even if they can't figure out how to disable the trap as a result, at least they know if their trigger is there, they can avoid it. Positioning of a trap is a serious design issue as well. Not only should the trap make sense for the effects that it produces, but it should be logical for the layout of the map that you place it in. An adventure designer might get by with randomly placing traps around a room on occasion, but by and large, traps should serve a greater purpose. In the game world, traps take time and effort to create. If a chest is trapped, for instance, then it should contain something of value to make the trap worthwhile for the person that actually placed the trap. If the corridor is trapped, the traps should be placed in such a manner so as to deter or foil intruders, unless said corridor's builder wants people to enter and then be unable to leave. At that point, consider traps that arm once they're passed through, then spring on the way back out, or traps that activate behind the party to trap them in. In very few cases should traps seem like gotcha moments, put there simply just to be there. Another important aspect of traps is how the trap is reset, and whether it needs to be completely reset to trigger again or not. Most simple traps can't reset themselves and only trigger once, while most standard traps have a single use as well. A few of those, however, might include multiple shots, but generally speaking, a trap is going to require some sort of outside energy source to reset itself. Electronic and magic traps in their respective settings might be able to auto-reset, but most mechanical traps can't, barring a few complex traps with access to water or gravity resets. A few standard traps might be able to as well, such as a counterweighted cover over a pit trap, but these are generally in the minority. Practically speaking, this means that you get one real shot at springing a trap on a party. Further, this means that most traps can be avoided simply by triggering them from a safe distance. Perhaps the most important thing to consider, especially as an adventure designer, is that traps and hazard almost always are target neutral. They don't care what they're crushing, maiming, frying, etc. The PCs could do it, some monsters could do it, whatever. If they're triggered, they go off and their effects happen regardless. Now, some creatures might be immune to a trap's effects, but that doesn't mean that the trap avoided them. It simply targeted them and did nothing. As I mentioned above, this means that canny players can use some traps against their opponents, which should be considered when placing them. Normally, the monsters, enemies, NPCs, or whatever who live in an area generally have a home advantage, knowing where the traps are and how to avoid them. But that's not always the case, especially when multiple factions live in an area. Further, it can be subverted if the party's opponents are also from somewhere else, and an interesting scene could be had where opposing groups are battling or running through a trap-filled structure where neither group knows where the traps are. The process of discovering and disarming traps is also something that should be considered as well, especially if you want the traps to be memorable. So many groups I've seen just reduce it to a simple roll that's usually accompanied by a very bland request, which admittedly speeds play, but also reduces what might be an interesting challenge to a simple yes-no binary roll. I've gone over this a little bit in my OSR video, and many others have discussed it as well, but if you're going to use traps in your adventures, you're probably going to want to let your players instruct you how they intend to search for the traps, or search areas in general. This might give them the opportunity to automatically discover trap triggers without necessarily needing any rolls. It can also result in them completely missing the trap entirely if they're approaching it in a way that has no chance of discovering it. A few times, groups of mine have even approached and triggered a trap in a manner that offered them no real ability to find it, but then completely avoided the effects of the traps because of that same description on how they were arranged and moving. And that's the kind of close call that can make the players thank their luck. So as I wrap it up here, I've only given a few obvious examples of specific traps, but hopefully I've given you some ideas on the sorts of general uses and general design principles that you'll probably want to put into your traps. Specific traps can, as I've said, be found in many basic RPG groups, and if you're looking for complex traps, there's entire source books out there that detail nothing but traps of various sorts. While many of these are system-specific, the ideas can usually be translated between RPG systems with minimal effort. A personal favorite of mine is Grimtooth's Ultimate Traps collection, which is currently available from Goodman Games, I think. It's absolutely huge and includes a nice mix of simple and complex traps. I know there were a number of trap books produced by third parties for 3rd edition, and a number of PDFs that list traps like a bestiary might list monsters available, and those are usually up on RPG Now. But at the end of the day, there's nothing quite like devising your own cruel machinations to throw on your group. And I'm going to leave it at that. If you've enjoyed this, please leave a like. Comment below if you've got any feedback, or even stories about traps you've encountered or used in your own adventures. Subscribe for more RPG content if you haven't already. If you'd like to support the channel or get early access to videos like this, please check out my Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler or through the links at the end of the video or in the description below. Until next time, take care and goodbye.